Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that, despite the warning, won't stop touching its face. Did I always touch my face as much? Am I a face toucher? Oh god, oh god, oh god! And how are you, Rob?
I'm feeling that intro a lot right now. I never thought I was a germaphobe until this all blew up, and now I'm like, oh my goodness, I do all these terrible things. Why am I such a terrible person to be around?
Yes, no, I completely understand that. I like having a beard on my face, that there is a tendency to touch my face to like do thinking and pondering. That I was aware of. Like, I knew that's probably more than the average person touches their chin. But then as soon as someone's like, don't touch your face, it's like, oh, I've touched my eyebrow, I've touched my nose. Oh, there's something on my face. Yeah, it's amazing. And the extra hand washing, it's like when I used to work in a lab and my skin is getting very, very dry. And I just have to lather myself in moisturizer. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's all... Hey, we'll probably go... We'll touch on it on the main story, but yeah. Things have got weird recently. I mean, we've been looking back over this 2020, and I think we've survived bushfires so far, and like a possible World War III. Do you remember that when that was a possibility in January, and flooding in February? It's only March. It's only March, and it's been a year. It really has. So yeah. As always, I like to start the podcast off on a positive note, so that's me with the maximum positivity. Could probably jump into the equally positive news stories we've got in the way.
So yeah, we'll move on into our headlines for tonight. Last time we were talking about Priti Patel and how there were bullying claims and all these other claims. And, you know, generally it didn't look very good. And there was a kind of a political... there's no smoke without fire, something must be going on. And then in what I think was quite an unprecedented move, the Home Office like chief, was it permanent secretary?
Yes, that's correct.
This is a permanent, like lifetime position with the civil service. If you get it, it's the kind of thing people want to get in the civil service, and they stay there. And it's, you know, it's that kind of position in the civil service you want to achieve. Imagine Sir Humphrey from Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. And he resigned, the one at the Home Office, stating Priti Patel basically is the reason. Is that a good enough summary?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, the astonishing thing was that he'd had a career of 33 years. And the main reason why he said he resigned, in his own words, was that in the last 10 days, I have been the target of a vicious and orchestrated briefing campaign. Essentially, to translate this a little bit, the stories we were talking about last time, particularly the one that MI5 didn't trust Priti Patel, somebody within the Home Office thought there was a leak, and the idea behind this, or at least the reason we think that Sir Philip Rutman has resigned, is because Priti thought it was him who leaked it and started briefing against him, saying that you shouldn't trust him, essentially, or putting undue pressure on him. And he felt this was part of a sort of a bullying campaign, and that's what led him to step down. He stepped down publicly, basically because he was offered a reconciliation with the Home Secretary. He said basically he wanted to try and establish a relationship there again after he thought it broke down, but he thought that Priti wasn't. In his own words, he said that despite my efforts to engage with her, Priti Patel has made no effort to engage with me to discuss this. He then went on to say that I believe that these events give me very strong grounds to claim constructive, unfair dismissal, and I will be pursuing that claim in the courts. This is essentially the Home Office airing their dirty laundry in public, and puts more fuel on the fire that Priti Patel, when she operates her businesses in cabinet positions, often has quite a confrontational approach with her staff. And this was a story that led to lots of other civil servants essentially piping up and saying, hey, I've experienced a similar feeling whilst working for Priti Patel in the past. Understandably, it's a very bad look for her, and although she's got the support of Boris Johnson and she made a very public display in the next PMQs where she was sort of on the flank of Boris Johnson. It's hard to keep up that pressure and stay in your job. She's clearly somebody who has the favour of number 10. If she didn't, I think she'd be out by now. And she might be at the mercy of that other world events have taken over the front pages. We'll get on to, like, you know, coronavirus as one of those. But equally, on the same day that this story broke, Boris Johnson announced that him and his wife, Carrie Symonds, were engaged to be married, and also that they were expecting their first child together. Of course, it's not a first child for Boris. For Boris, it's his 6th or 7th. I don't think even he can keep count.
Yeah, I mean, this is the famous joke at the moment, and I don't know if you watched The Last Leg on Friday.
I didn't. No, fill me in.
So they had John Bercow on. I think I sent you a clip. And yeah, that was quite amusing. But one of the questions they put to him was, how many Father's Day cards will Boris Johnson get? Which is a slight... they also did they ran a quiz past Bercow of faces of MPs, and he had to get their name and their constituency. Mm-hmm. And that was quite fun. They threw in a few red herrings, like one who was MP for Buckingham in like 1850, and a few others. But all the ones who were like current MPs, he got correct.
It's funny that you bring up Bercow, because his name has been brought up in the same sentence as Patel by many of those on the right. So Bercow has faced similar bullying accusations whilst he was Speaker at the House of Commons, and those still follow him around. It's one of the reasons why they say that he wasn't given a peerage, although other people suspect it might be that his leadership of the House during Brexit might be the real reason the government is unwilling. And many people have said that, oh, you treat Bercow with these rose-tinted spectacles. You know, he's done exactly the same as Priti Patel did. Why should there be one rule for one and one rule for another? Essentially, I think if Bercow's been a bully, he should face the consequences the same as Patel. That seems fairly obvious to me. Bullying in the workplace is never acceptable, and from the stories that came out of both, if they are true, then yes, it's right that Bercow isn't awarded a peerage, and I think, in my opinion, it would be right for Patel to lose her cabinet position. But these things are often so tied up in personal politics that we often lose sight of what's right or wrong, I think, just because of, you know, which side of the political spectrum you stand on. So that's just a little aside, but yeah, it's interesting that Bercow was on the last leg in the same time as these allegations from Priti Patel were going around the news media.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with you. If the accusations are proven, then it's fine and reasonable for him to be punished in that way. I think the difference here is that, like, it seems like more is happening right now in the middle of this, whereas, like, I know that there was discussion of with Bercow. I mean, the question with Bercow was whether he was properly investigated at the time. I think that's the kind of lasting question from that, was like, because basically he said, oh, it didn't happen, and then there wasn't as much of an investigation, but there is an investigation going on to Priti Patel. It's the same person who investigated one of Theresa May's aides early on as well, I believe.
Okay.
Who also was, you know, essentially kicked out of their position because they were found to be, you know, have done something. I can't remember the exact details of that, but it was brought up around this case. So yeah, we'll just have to wait and see. But it does seem like there's some truth to the allegations if someone that senior is stepping down based on it.
Yeah, the BBC editor Laura Koonsberg said it was unprecedented for a civil servant to make such a bold claim like this and to have it as front page news. Usually they leave quite quietly, or there's a degree of loyalty to their position and the government that they don't do this sort of thing. So it kind of makes more of a story that this is a government that is maybe at odds with the civil service, or really wants to shake up the status quo and tackle an institution that some people outside might think has been too comfortable for too long. It all depends on your perspective, I guess, of what the civil service is there to do. And this has been a conversation that's been going on for years. do you think the civil service is there to serve the government and just act, the government says jump and the civil service says how high? Or are the civil service there as another check on power? Are they the ones that are meant to say, you could do this, but hold on, just wait a minute. You mentioned Sir Humphrey from Yes Minister. When you were talking about senior civil servants, he was the one who was sort of seen as a reins of control on the government sort of putting their plans into perspective or into reality, and sometimes being able to change their policy position entirely, because he was worried that they would go down a dangerous line, and he could see it causing trouble for the government in the long term. So those two views of the civil service still very much at odds. It appears that this government really is determined. It sees the civil service as a barrier it needs to overcome, particularly if it wants to get its ambitious Brexit plans through in time and by the end of the year.
So for our next headline, let me paint you a picture of my Saturday evening. I'd spent all day walking around London, going on public transport and stuff, because, you know what, I know there is a virus about, but at the moment, the advice is just carry on as normal. If you're ill, you have to isolate yourselves and get checked. But like, that's flu symptoms. It's not like if you have a sniffle. And we'll talk about that, I think, later on. But, you know, I'd been at an event in London that involved going around on the tube. I come home and I'm like, I should probably go get some food. Go to Tesco's, quite a large Tesco's, big Tesco Extra. And I'm going down the aisles, and, you know, most of the aisles are fine. I've heard some stories online about, you know, toilet roll being sold out and other silly things. And I turn into the aisle to buy some eggs, only to find that all of the eggs have been bought out as long as they're free range. All of the tomatoes have been bought out as long as it's passata and chopped tomatoes, but not any of those peeled plum tomatoes that are also in cans. So I feel like we're having a very kind of weirdly middle class panic at the moment, where certain, like, the easy things have been over purchased. People panic buying. Did see a man being berated by his wife. He was in a mask, which again is against the advice unless you are someone who's immunocompromised in very specific circumstances. And his wife just being like, "You're not going to eat all this." Panic buying has happened, and then this has gone into, this is linked into stock market fall, which is not entirely due to that. I believe there's something to do with oil going on as well, isn't there?
Yes, essentially, this is a story that the stock markets have had their biggest fall since the 2008 crash, basically triggered by a number of factors, most notably the coronavirus or COVID-19, which was pointed out to me on Twitter. That COVID-19, you have to say to the tune of "Come on, Eileen," and now you
COVID-19, COVID-19,
yeah. Now you are just infected with that knowledge, as I am. This is the stock markets basically went crazy when trading opened on Monday, seeing a huge dip. There was a dip of 7% on Wall Street, which actually triggered an alarm, which basically says, "Whoa, we have to stop trading because traders can't keep up." Everybody took 15 minutes to take a breath, and then it started again, and the plunge didn't stop. As you mentioned, there's a little something to do with oil as well. Essentially, the Russians and Saudi Arabia are having a dispute about how much to charge for oil at the moment. There is a big drop in demand because, most notably, air travel has gone down along the world, as you see countries like, most notably today, I think Italy, British Airways have stopped all flights in and out of Italy today because of the lockdown that's in progress there. And that's having a knock-on effect on many airlines as well. We saw the closure of Flybe over the weekend, which, I mean, I was quite shocked at that. It goes to show how tenuous Flybe's position was if it only took one round of stopping planes to suddenly mean, no, that's the end of their business. But all of these factors combine to mean that there is a slow in global demand, and this leads to a huge stock market crash, which has wiped a lot of money. I don't know, I was about to say millions or billions, but the truth is I don't quite know the exact figure. Wiped.
It was 8%, I think, across most of them. And I mean, that's presumably trillions, not billions, when you talk about the markets as a whole.
Yeah. And And when you say 2008 crash, your kind of ears prick up and go, oh my goodness, I know that was a bad one. This must be equally bad. It's one of the big effects that this coronavirus is having on us, and it's affecting, it's starting to touch every part of our lives. I know as somebody who works, I don't work on the front line NHS, but I work like back office at the moment. You are seeing the effects trickle through, and the plans that the government has put in place seems to be a delay tactic now, I would say. It seems to be a question of when the next stage of containment starts rather than if. And yeah, it's affecting us all. I think even though, you might consider yourself quite young and healthy, it's the other people in your lives that you don't want to infect or have that type of impact on that's the real concern. And like you say, this has led to a load of panic buying in shops, most notably loo roll. I heard a good joke the other day, which was people have stopped shaking hands because of the coronavirus. I've stopped shaking hands because I know people aren't using toilet paper anymore. It's all run out. So, yeah, the world, it appears, has gone a bit mad, or at least we're going into territory that's only been seen in movies before. I'm not a scientist. The only advice I can say is to keep calm and carry on. But this virus has touched everyone, and that's what I'd like to move on to in our main story tonight. The person who seems to be struggling maybe the most to come to terms with the full impact and how you should react to this virus, President Trump.
Yeah, I mean, we should move on to the main story then, which is, as you say, is Trump and the coronavirus. I've heard a lot of hot takes on the various things he said, but I suppose we're going to get down into the nitty-gritty of that.
What things have you heard him say? Are there any that stick in your head?
I mean, I think basically the key one I heard was the bit where he was like saying, "Oh well, it's basically it's over now." Like just as the cases were getting worse in the US, he's like, "Oh, it's fine." I don't know the exact quote, but that was the takeaway one that got round to me via various outlets.
Have you heard him saying that we're ordering lots of elements of medical?
I did not hear that, but that is the most Trumpian thing to say.
It's very Trumpian, and I will advise all our listeners to go and seek out Michael Spicer. He has a Twitter account and a YouTube. He does the Room Next Door. Have you seen his stuff?
Yeah, he's recently been doing it long enough that he's actually able to make it his full-time job, and he's quit his day job essentially to take up being a comedian. I've seen him on like one or two things before, but I think he's kind of really taken off recently, and my housemate was showing me a lot of his clips.
He's great. I mean, we've been talking about Priti as well, and his take on the Priti Patel counter-terrorism offenders is incredible as well. So go and look that up. There's been a lot of, like you say, there's a lot of buzz around it, a lot of smack talk basically being talked about President Trump and the daft things he's saying. Big whoop, Trump always says things that are a little stupid, to be quite frank, or a bit out there that make you just raise an eyebrow and go, hey, is this guy really the president of the United States? But this is a crisis that's like a huge challenge for Trump, and one that I think where he is uniquely at a disadvantage. I've taken most of this from like a brilliant article that was published by the BBC today. So I don't know if you want to drop that in chat or look in the show notes for that. I'd encourage you to read that because it's a really good take about how this is kind of a challenge that I think Trump is really going to struggle with, and the old Trumpian tactics just won't work with this particular crisis. So I'll move on to the first point, which kind of leads on from our headline. So the first big challenge for Trump is the stock market. So essentially, Trump has based a lot of his value to that of a booming stock market. He's tweeted about it over 280 times since office, and it kind of links with Trump's good for business brand. He's been seen on camera kind of at the end of the interview saying, hey, how's your 401k doing? Kind of saying to his supporters, look, your investment profiles are bigger than ever, and you've only got one person to thank, and That's me, baby. That's me. It also speaks to his core supporters as well, who are likely to be conservative, very wealthy, and able to invest in the stock market in a large degree. And until Corona, there had been a couple of dips, but the stock market had recovered incredibly well. And despite all the worries that Trump's trade war might cause the stock markets to crash or might cause productivity to go down, it'd been remarkably resilient. So Trump seemed to be benefiting from this because, I mean, the other factor is that when you move into an election year, like 2020 is, you want to have a booming economy, and being able to point to the stock market as as the thing that rises the most and has succeeded most under your premiership, particularly when you compare it to Obama, because then again, Trump loves comparing himself to Obama. It was one of the big plus points for Trump, and it was one that was hard for his critics to kind of, undermine him on. You couldn't argue with the facts. Yes, the stock market has boomed under President Trump. It's always been said by Clinton, it's the economy, stupid. If Trump says, I can manage a good economy, and in his own words, I think he said the US economy was the biggest ever. Side note, it isn't. It's been a lot better in the past, but we all know Trump likes to exaggerate a little bit. But if he's able to, say that, and there's a few people who can argue with the fact that the economy's doing well, then that's going to be a huge plus point.
Yeah, the thing I just want to mention is there's a very good episode actually of Freakonomics on this, but it's one of these things where presidents always, as you say, Clinton said it's the economy, stupid. Presidents will talk about how important a role they have on the economy, but nearly all of the evidence weighs out that actually it has very little to do with the president. But the average person will vote as if it is quite important. So and it also tends to be that someone who has already been president, if they had a good economic term, are significantly more likely to be re-elected because people will associate the state of the economy with that president, regardless of the fact that actually the president has very little functional effect on the economy.
Oh, yeah, totally. Even Trump himself has said that he's been quite frustrated with the actions of the basically the federal side that deals with the economy. He says, hey, these guys should be doing more, and I can't make them do more. I'm trying to pressure them into a decision. So, yeah, it's interesting that even Trump has admitted that to an extent, but he's more than willing to take all the praise for a good economy. Which kind of moves us on to our next point, that it's a super risky tactic to place your worth against the stock market, because markets are notoriously volatile, and as quickly as they can go up, they can go down, as we saw in the headlines today. When you have a 2008 style crash, then it's hard not, when Trump's linked so much of his success to the strength of the stock market, now do you see that as a huge weakness? I think SNL labeled it the Trump slump. They said, people are calling it the Trump slump. And then they said, well, people aren't calling it the Trump slump, but this is a tactic that Trump uses all the time. Trump says, people are calling. So we're just going to keep on saying it until it becomes a thing. And it did get trending on Twitter after they said that. So this Trump slump has kind of become a thing. It makes it look very bad for Trump, particularly as we've said in an election year. It then undermines him, and if the economy is struggling, and if he fails to give the economy a jump start after this crisis, then it may mean people turn to the Democrats to help fix that. And another question mark is kind of, has Trump used up all of his tricks to try and keep that financial stimulus? There was some worries amongst economists that he was keeping federal rates deliberately low or putting pressure in that manner to try and boost the stock market even more, to force the economy to boom even more for him coming into 2020. If they're unable to lower them anymore to try and balance out this negative effect, then it could make the crash a lot worse than it could have been, which again makes it a super risky tactic for Trump. So particularly the stock market side of the corona thing is already looking bad for Trump. But of course, it's not just the stock market that's affected, it's people's health and the virus itself. So that's what I'd like to touch on next.
It's a very different type of thing for Trump to deal with. Like, you know, he has to deal with the reality of the situation here, and it's like, I feel like this is the kind of thing. It's like if he'd got into a war or something, you know, people get a certain war weariness after a while. You can say, oh, we're doing quite well, but then the numbers come back of how many people have died, in this case from a virus, and or you know, here's a mistake that we made at government level, and again, he's seen as the figurehead for all of that, even if potentially it's due to an organisation lower down the chain that messed something up. Yeah, I mean, I'm talking in very general terms. I'm not referencing anything in particular, but again, this is one of those things where it's like seen as his leadership is key here. And I'm sure the president does have quite a bit of a role, you know, his money being put into this area, stuff like that. But it's he has very little control over what's going to happen next. And it's one of those things where it's like, people probably think he has more of an effect on this than he does. I would like to hope he has less of an effect, because I want to think that the scientists and people who are doing things at a level below him will be doing the best they can, and hopefully that means less people will die. But again, it remains to be seen how this all plays out, because I mean, if it kind of goes away a bit, he could turn that into a victory, right, with his kind of usual rhetoric.
Yes, he could, but I think the likelihood of it going away is like next to zero, I would say. It's very, very low. Like, this is, you can see how other how other countries in the world have reacted to this, and it's quite a slow progress of, right, we're going to try and contain the virus, and if we can't contain it, then we'll delay, then we'll go into another stage. But he seems to almost be in denial that there will be a later phase. He seems to still be in this, we can stop it all happening and it'll die out without us having to do much kind of phase. Kind of, like, you know, with some of the things he said, like you mentioned at the start, some of his interviews, he said, the numbers are going down when they're not. And if you know anything about, like, the way this virus has been spreading and the way it's been reported, it's very unlikely that it goes down until it's reached sort of a peak. I think numbers are only starting to go down in China and South Korea, and it's clear they've had the worst of it so far.
And their method, I mean, the methods employed in China, for example, have been basically everyone's in homes. There's and they're now doing this in Italy as well, where, you know, they have police driving around with speakers saying stay in your homes unless you absolutely have to, etc., etc. So slightly different, but I mean, in China they've done a bit more of a lockdown. But now, as you say, like, I think it's Lombardy, which is where Milan is in northern Italy, is in lockdown. As you mentioned earlier, with the flights not happening from BA. So yeah, it's possible that we can stop this becoming a massive pandemic, although the World Health Organization has said it's more likely to become a pandemic now. But I think, I mean, the UK government is still like, we're in the contain period, as opposed to the delay period, which is one of these 3 steps COBRA have agreed on. So at the moment, it's not like we're not banning all gatherings and so on, but that's kind of the next step. So there is still a chance that it could be contained, so that a lot less people get it. But as you say, there's still a peak to come in the US with infections, probably still a peak to come in the UK and other European countries that haven't got to the state Italy is in.
Yeah, precisely. And feeding this back into Trump's leadership, we've always talked about the position of the president and how much power they have over some things and how little power they have over others. So Trump has always sought to negate this in different ways. So Congress might say, you need to do this, but Trump will send out a tweet or will go over their head, and he will always try and influence public opinion in a way to make his view louder and more important than the others. We've remarked on this podcast before how, you know, Trump's sort of foreign secretary, as you were, has very little power on what actually that in the direction that the US is traveling, because it only takes one tweet from Trump to have a go at a nation or offer reconciliation, and that's what has the real punch. Now, you can't tweet about a virus. You can't outmaneuver a virus in the same way. And in particular, he now has to, where he's often dismissed experts in the part, he now has to rely on them and follow their advice. And the problem is that he's already contradicting officials and contradicting the advice of his own vice president. So, for example, Trump has promised that he would give tests to all that need them, but Vice President Pence had to admit that there weren't enough available at this current time. Trump has tried to tweet about it and out-tweet the virus. I've included his tweet that he did about the flu, which was, so last year 37,000 Americans died from the common flu. It averages between 27,000 and 70,000 a year. Nothing is shut down. Life and the economy go on. At this moment, there are 546 confirmed cases of coronavirus with 22 deaths. Think about that. Translated, it's just the flu, dummy. Carry on.
There is somewhere in there's the kernel of an idea which is worth spreading to people who are absolutely panicking about this, which is that this is flu-like and the vast majority of people survive, but it's the mortality rate of 2% is higher than flu. And you still should be getting a flu jab if you're going to be working near people who can, hospital workers, for example, and teachers get the flu jab because of their profession. So, if we had a vaccine, which we don't at the moment for COVID-19, we would be giving people that vaccine. Obviously, not having that there affects the numbers as well. But if the average, people like us should not need to be worried about the infection because we are in the prime of our lives, healthy and live in a country where there is healthcare, which I know is something universal healthcare, which I know is something we'll get to in a minute. But obviously, it's the people, it's your grandparents, it's people who have AIDS, people who are undergoing cancer therapies. So chemotherapy knocks out your immune system. There are multiple things that make you more susceptible, and if it's a 2% risk as opposed to the normal 0.1% fatality rate of flu, just because we're used to how flu is, this is different to flu. And I think that's the thing where people are struggling to deal with it. Some people are overreacting, and I think some people are probably underreacting. And there's a kind of sensible part in the middle. There's a GIF I've put in the show notes, actually, well, in the chat, which is talking about how, if you do nothing, you don't wash your hands, don't follow the advice, the curve of infections can mean that it goes up above the healthcare system's capacity, and this is based on numbers from the CDC. But if you follow the advice, what you're doing is you're helping to flatten that curve so that less people die, and that more people just have kind of generic symptoms and survive. So, yeah, it is a tricky thing for some people to understand, I think, and I get that. It doesn't help the media is just ticking up number of deaths. We don't do that with the flu every year because it would drive everyone bananas. And lots of people do die from the flu every year. It's unfortunate. But yeah, he's drawing a kind of false equivalence.
Yeah, and I don't think any other leader of a major nation has come out and said, don't really worry about this. It's kind of like the responsibility of that leader to, be sensible, offer the healthcare advice, follow the expert script, and try and say, this is, trying to just say, this is serious and you should really wash your hands and do this, but don't panic, is kind of what the leader should be doing. That tweet kind of undermines a lot of people's efforts and will have made, I bet, a lot of people at the CDC very angry.
And understandably so. This is as you say earlier, this is where people should be listening to experts. Trump does not have any shred of medical learning, as far as I can tell, so he is not the person to listen to here.
Yeah, and it's that kind of stuff that's frustrating, and makes him unpopular and potentially dangerous advice. My next point, just going on to it, is that coronavirus isn't kind of a political fight in the culture wars. It's very sciencey. And I will compare it to something that is quite sciencey, but has been drawn into the same culture war. So let's talk about global warming. Trump has been very anti-global warming in his sentiment. That's something that should be a very scientific problem. Like the majority of scientists all agree that it is a problem that needs to be dealt with. However, that has been dragged into a part of a culture war by people saying, it's not really that much of a problem. Don't be so doom and gloom about it. And maybe most significantly, in my point of view anyway, if you are a big business or somebody who relies on the consumption of oil or fossil fuels or sees anti-global warming legislation as damaging to your business, then you would lobby against that. So that turns it into a sort of like a pro and an anti-side, and you would see logically why somebody would be pro-global warming because they were trying to protect their business interests, if that makes sense. Like there's a connection there. Nobody is going to be pro this virus, to put it quite simply. It's nameless, faceless, and it's bad for business. There's going to be no lobbyists basically on the side of this.
No one is in the pay of big virus, is what you're saying.
Basically, yeah. So that makes it a problem that Trump can't kind of tweet or bully out of existence. Trump has, in the past, been a very good counterpuncher. Somebody like Greta Thunberg will have a go at him and he'll punch right back. They'll come up with a snappy nickname for them and will say, look, I'm right because of XYZ. He can't do this with this virus. He just has to accept it, and he seems he's not sure how to accept it. One of the big examples I've put up is this cruise ship that's off the coast of Florida. Trump was asked at a recent event when he was at the CDC looking at test kits what he thought the American government should do about this ship. He mentioned that experts had a different idea and that they'd be brought onto land, but he said that he thought the ship should be kept out in sea. And one of the reasons he said it's because as soon as they come on the land, then that adds to our numbers, which to me showed that Trump was kind of worried that the number of infected would go up if the people came off the ship and onto the USA, just because it looked bad for PR. He seems to have the wrong sort of, in my opinion, the wrong idea of how you fight this or how you represent this. He seems concerned with keeping the numbers down, but maybe some part of the reason why the number of confirmed cases in the US is so low at the moment is because there is a big lack of testing kits out there. So it means that those who are infected aren't being picked up yet. And of course, that in the long term is far more dangerous. You can't hide the problem forever by just refusing to report it. The virus don't work in that way. So yeah, that's just like another reason that it undermines Trump, and he's finding it hard to tackle it. And then the impact of that is kind of the final reason why Trump will struggle, and that's essentially the lack of a welfare state in the USA, something that you touched on earlier. Did you have any points that you wanted to say on like that, on your impression?
I mean, I think the point here is, we have the NHS. If I get ill or am worried that I need to have a test, I can go for free at the end of as an end user, I can for free get checked out and have medical care. And as I said earlier and touched on, people in the prime of their lives are probably less likely to be affected by this. But it's those people who are more vulnerable who are going to be affected most. So it's people who are older, it's people who don't have immune systems or have suppressed immune systems at the moment. Those people will be more affected. People who are in that position are already in the US having to spend significant amount of money. If you have a long-term illness, then you may struggle to get insurance or be paying a lot for your insurance in the US. Or say you're uninsured, how are you going to pay? I don't know how much they're charging for tests over there, or if they are. It would seem like a really reasonable thing for the government to do, to say all testing is free because it's a national emergency. But I wouldn't be surprised if someone is trying to charge for tests or something like that. And even then, the care is not free. So if you do get tested and you can't just self-isolate, you need to be looked after, then you're paying to go to the hospital. And it's people who are vulnerable. It's, again, it's not about the people who are rich, the people who are healthy in general who get this and probably will be fine. It's more about those people who are going to be in the most vulnerable position. And I know there are hospitals in the US that offer like free care, like or to certain people as like a kind of charitable thing. They're either charitable hospitals or they're part of their hospitals, like this many patients can come in. But this is where you get the problems when there's suddenly a pandemic kind of levels of something. More people will be rushing in and using that service. I mean, we will still likely have problems here because the NHS is overstretched as it is, and then there'll be more people. But it's not a concern that suddenly I'm going to have to pay 10,000 just to do something about this. And for people who are less well off, that's where you're going to have the problems, and that could lead to an increase in deaths because those people were. And also, it's kind of it's a two-pronged thing. So if you are too poor to get hold of cover and be looked after, go to an intensive care unit or be quarantined by a hospital, well, then where are you going to be? You're going to be out and about. You're going to spread the disease again, and that's going to feed back into that problem. So where all these states where there's no universal healthcare, if they're not able to get that on some kind of special insurance thing, if they're not able to put in some kind of special measure, that's where your problem is going to be. People who can't go to hospital because they can't afford it. Oh, it's just a cough. They go around for 2 weeks spreading it, and that's the problem we're seeing with coronavirus, is that it's easy to spread because you cannot know you have it for quite a while, and you can be in this shedding phase, it's called, where you're shedding the virus, but you don't have any symptoms. And also people can be asymptomatic. But let's not go too much into the science here. My point is that people who can't go and get the help they need will be in the position where they're going around, and because they're likely to infect other people, and that I feel will make it worse if they don't do something about it. And so that makes the spread of everything worse, and that makes problems that shows in sharp relief the problems with the US system that people talk about. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out.
Yeah, precisely. You've talked about healthcare a lot. The other thing that the US is lacking is any sort of sick pay or cover, statutory sick pay. So that was one of the first things that was brought up in the UK in the Parliament. People said, you've recommended that one way to stop this is self-isolation for a period of 2 weeks. Is the government willing to cover that? And then Boris Johnson said, yes, we will. Which is, okay, great. That's going to be a move that puts businesses at ease. It's going to make sure that people say, no, I have got a cough. Okay, I will self-isolate, knowing that it won't have any impact on my finances or the way I move forward. In the US, 39 states don't offer any sort of federal sick pay, which means that if you've got a cough, you're more likely to say, okay, I'll risk it, I'll go to work, because otherwise, if I self-isolate and it wasn't anything at all, I'm going to lose out on 2 weeks of wages, and guess what? I need that to pay my rent. And those sort of cracks in the system, that lack of a safety net or a welfare state in the US, will really be shown up if the virus hits the US in a big way. And I think it's fair to say that Trump is not a big proponent of big government. He doesn't want to extend the welfare state. The people who do will be the Democrats, particularly any potential rival he'll have in the 2020 election. Joe Biden to an extent, but most notably Bernie Sanders is advocating Medicare for all. And depending on the scale and impact that coronavirus has in the USA, if a lot of people are affected in a negative way, then the push for the welfare state as a result of this crisis could really ramp up, and I don't think that's likely to play in Trump's favor. So, yeah, just to round up how much of a conundrum this is for Trump, the fact that it's going to expose this long-term weakness that I think the US has had in the way that it cares for its citizens. It has a very minimal welfare state. The push for that may grow even more, particularly when there is momentum behind that push. It could ultimately mean the end of the Trump presidency. I think a lot of us foresaw a lot of ways that Trump might be taken down. A lot of us thought impeachment, or, he'd be able to shoot himself in the foot in another way. I don't think any of us saw this coming. But the way he reacts to it will, be a big mark in his legacy, I think, as a president. Every president has a crisis to deal with. This is his, and from what I've seen so far, I'm not quite sure he has the tools at his disposal to deal with it in an effective manner.
I don't really have much else to add, but it will be interesting to see how this affects poll ratings and stuff like that, because you would like to think this is the kind of thing where people would see the benefit of increasing the welfare state, and therefore that would make people consider whoever the Democratic nominee is. But there's also a lot of personality going on in politics, so every president will have to deal with various crises during their tenure. It's interesting to see how, because this is very much one that is outside of his field of expertise. As you said, he's not very good at. He's focusing on the wrong things, essentially. Someone like, we don't want to hark back and say, oh well, if only it was Obama, but Obama was good at going to his experts and saying, okay, what should I do in this situation? In a way that Trump is not so good at doing, as we've touched on. So it is an interesting case study from that point of view. But obviously we would wish that the virus wasn't about and wasn't spreading. But yeah, it's one of these things where it will probably have an interesting effect on the race, the presidential race that's coming up.
Precisely. I think you saying like we can look back to Obama, but I think it would stretch back further than that. I think any traditional presidential model would have handled this in a very different way to Trump. We've always said that Trump is very odd in his presidential style, and he does a lot of things. Yeah, his style is not presidential. And with this crisis, you need that calm, collected leadership at the top, and it's something that Trump has never provided through his time as president. And now it's really showing. Sorry, you can cut that bit out, but yeah, just thought it was worth it. It's not just Obama. I think Bush would have handled this way better, and even Reagan, Carter, Kennedy, whoever you want to go back in time. A lot of those traditional presidential styles are far better suited to dealing with a crisis like this, where you have to band together and say, no, listen to the experts, do this. Trump has always just done his own thing, and that is a real negative at this point.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. That's an important point, that it's just that Trump stands alone in this kind of field of presidents that we've had. The one final thing I just want to add in is that advice is constantly changing on the outbreak of COVID-19. So don't treat this podcast as advice on anything. I've tried to keep up and date and informed with it, but what you should always be doing is checking in the UK, the NHS, in the US, the CDC, wherever you're living, your equivalent services are the people you should be checking for advice. And yeah, I just want to put that in there. I think I'm relatively read up and informed on it. I haven't read all the papers, and I've been listening to a fair bit of analysis, but that doesn't mean anything I say should be taken as gospel. I am not a infectious disease researcher.
Oh, God, yeah. If you're coming to me about anything, advice-wise, anything, don't listen to me. God, just take that point home.
Yep. So, talking about presidential races, we're going to move on to our quick polls update. And I think we had a bumper week of results last week, because we had Super Tuesday. Did we explain what Super Tuesday was last time to the listeners? I think it might be worth touching on again.
Yeah, we did, but Super Tuesday is the big day in the primary race where a whole lot of states vote at the same time on who they want their presidential nominee to be for the Democrat and Republican Party. This time round, the Republican Party is all sewn up. Usually the incumbent wins, and Trump is running away with that, so nobody's really paying attention to it. The big one is the Democrats and who's going to win. And I know this is meant to be our quick polls update section, but I just wanted to give a super quick overview of everything that's happened since last time we spoke about the primary race and now, because a lot has changed. So I will try and be as brief as possible, but Super Tuesday results essentially were really good for Joe Biden, okay for Bernie, and bad for the rest. So last time we had this podcast and we were talking about the primary race, we said, Biden came fourth in Iowa. That means he's practically dead in this race. He's the new Jeb Bush. He's never coming back from this. So how did Biden rise from the dead? So about a week before Super Tuesday, there was a race in South Carolina, which Biden unexpectedly romped. He won it by about 48%, and that made everybody stand up and go, he won it by 48.7% to Bernie Sanders' 19.8%. And that made everybody stand up and say, oh my goodness, Biden is still a very viable candidate in this race. Bernie traditionally has been struggling with black voters, or did so in 2016, and Biden has been performing well amongst this group. That may be a hark back to the fact that he ran with Obama in 2008 and 2012, and together they were able to get this winning coalition that featured black voters out to vote, and that essentially won them the election, or was one of the big tipping points. We saw back in 2016 that black voters tended to stay away. They didn't vote for Hillary Clinton, and that may have been a contributing factor to the reason why Trump was able to win the Electoral College the way that he did in 2016. So coming into Super Tuesday, Biden's got this new bump and a bit of momentum. He's then helped out by another two big candidates being basically dropping out. So Buttigieg, was it him? Paul.
Buttigieg.
Yes, thank you. He drops out, and Cool Child drops out as well. And they immediately endorse Biden. So all the votes that they were getting, essentially they say, if you've been voting for me, vote for Biden, he's my guy. So that instantly gives his campaign a little boost. So that leaves kind of four big candidates left in. You've got Bernie, who's got the early momentum, Biden, Bloomberg, who is the billionaire, other sort of moderate candidate along with Biden. But Bloomberg had a really horrible primary debate performance where he was basically destroyed by our other candidate in this race, Elizabeth Warren, who essentially said, we don't need another billionaire in the White House, we need somebody else in. So with his reputation damaged so much by those debates, I think it's reasonable to assume that some of the moderates may have seen Bloomberg as a wasted vote and moved their vote towards Biden. So with Warren still in, that means that the progressive vote is split, but the moderate vote is very much behind Biden, and he starts winning a lot of states. He wins the majority of states on Super Tuesday, and most importantly, he wins the big prize of Texas. Bernie still keeps some of his momentum, so Bernie wins California, which grabs a lot of delegates, but at the end of the night, Biden is ahead on delegates, and being ahead after Super Tuesday is super important, because that means that quite a lot of the states, about a third of the states, I think, have already made up their mind. And if you're ahead then it just gets, your path to nomination gets narrower and narrower as the number of delegates that are up for grabs goes down and time starts to run out. Looking forward to, so there's loads of votes happening tonight on Tuesday as we record. Since Super Tuesday, we've seen Warren drop out, so that's made it a two-horse race, and there is some hope amongst Bernie supporters that those who did support Warren in the past will naturally and ideologically support Bernie now. There's some debate to how effective that will be. To use a UK analogy, there's this kind of thing about like Bernie bros, similar to like Corbyn momentum people, which is, I'm trying to put a delicate way to say that some people think that Bernie supporters are very passionate.
Polarizing.
But they're also polarizing, yes, thank you. And that means that some who supported Warren might want to stay away from Bernie just because they feel that, you know, I've seen some things on Twitter, and of course you should never take Twitter as a acid test for anything, but some people saying, look, I supported Warren, and when I supported Warren, I was called a fascist for supporting her and not Bernie, and now she's dropped out. I've got all these Bernie supporters trying to convince me to come over to their side, and it's, hey, you know, maybe you should have been nice to me before. So that's the big worry for Bernie, and also my final point on this is that listening to the 538 podcasts and the views of Nate Silver and what their model predicts now, which is what we'll go on to. But the recent polls that have come out for this Tuesday's round of voting, they say if Bernie Sanders outperforms the current polls by 10 percentage points, so that's a huge swing in Bernie's favor, he would still struggle to make up ground on Biden. He would still fail to win the big prize of tonight, which is Michigan, because I think Biden is up by 20 to 24 points in that race. And yeah, that makes Bernie's chances of the nomination even narrow even more. So out of nowhere, it appears that Biden has got a lot of the momentum, and it's now Biden's to lose.
Your point about, if Warren's, if people who voted for Warren now switch to Bernie, well, if you look at, say, South Carolina, she got 7% of the vote. So even if all of her supporters went over to Bernie, then you've got Buttigieg and other people who had a percentage of that vote. So, because it's a two-horse race, it makes the maths a bit harder. It's not like, if Warren had dropped out and those votes had gone to Bernie, that could have given him an advantage potentially, but there's no splitting of the field between the Biden-like candidates either now. So it's a question of which of those styles of candidate are going to win, and it does seem likely to, from this point of view, that to be Biden, in my opinion.
Yeah, certainly. I don't know if we want to touch on the primary forecasts now.
So I mean, it's quite dramatic if you look at the graph on 538. So when we were last talking, the idea that there would be no clear winner of more than half of the pledged delegates seemed likely. But now there's only Biden, Sanders, and Gabbard still in. And both Sanders and Gabbard on 538 have a less than 1 in 100% chance, according to 538. And Biden's put in 99 out of 100. Like, you can just see this kind of, he had a slump and then it's a near meteoric rise back up to almost certainty for more than half of the pledged delegates, which would just win him the nomination. If you look at plurality of them, same picture. It's just 99%. He's just smashed it, basically. So that's what's so surprising, because it's just kind of, as you say, people was saying he was down and out. Now maybe Sanders will fare better in these upcoming races, but it seems unlikely, I think.
Yeah, all the polling suggests that Biden is going to win the big prize of the night, Michigan, and once he wins that, then the path to nomination for Sanders becomes very narrow once again. And unlike 2016, when a lot of people were complaining about the effects of superdelegates, Bernie supporters won't have that to fall back on this time. Now, this will be, I think, talking about all the momentum that Sanders had last time we talked about this about a month ago, we're kind of saying that, he had a very viable path to being the most radical presidential nominee that the Democratic Party has had. To see that slip away will be quite hard for those supporters to deal with, I think. And the next question is whoever wins the Democratic primary, will they be able to get the other side on board? This has been quite a vicious campaign, and a lot of people who, equate Biden as bad or worse than Trump in some cases, or at least you'd think so, seeing some of the discourse online. So again, it's been another very bruising primary campaign for the Democrats, and whoever wins will face that massive challenge of trying to unite the party once this is all over. You almost want at least one candidate to deliver a comprehensive finishing blow in the next round of primary results. If it looks like if Biden runs away with the 7 states that are voting tonight on March 10th, then I think it's unlikely that Sanders will suspend his campaign. Sanders fought all the way to the end when he went against Clinton, but he may want to think about changing his rhetoric and having a more of a conciliatory tone to make sure that the Democrats are well prepared to get that coalition of voters they need to defeat Trump, because once again, if they are infighting, then that just raises Trump's chances in 2020 even more.
So we've been looking at the primary forecast. Do we also want to have a look at the presidential
Yeah, let's have a look at that.
The most recent polls against Trump, Sanders and Biden just ahead in most of the polls. There's a recent Ipsos poll where they're even. But yeah, it's looking like overall both Biden and Sanders are just coming out ahead. It'll be interesting to see in the continuing fallout from the coronavirus outbreak how that affects the numbers, because as we were saying, that may have a negative effect on Trump's polling numbers. But will this narrow, or is this based kind of down party lines?
Yeah, and I think that there's a possibility. I know that Biden is not proposing universal healthcare like Bernie Sanders is, but a crisis in the nature of corona might make Biden change his message. If he sees it as, a politically viable one, it might be one that, becomes more of a push as more of the public see the effects of coronavirus. That's like one of the things I was saying in the main story. If the push becomes so widespread that Biden is unable to ignore it, then he may end up adopting that policy. And I think if he was to adopt that policy and keep some of his more moderate other policies when it comes to like foreign policy, for example, I think Bernie Sanders is rather radical in, the Americas' intervention in wars abroad, whereas as Biden has, he's been involved in Iraq and in other wars in the past, he would take a more sort of a more interventionist approach. If Biden is able to marry up those two sides of that coin, he might be able to persuade a lot more Bernie supporters to come on board. But that's a lot of what ifs and maybes for now. There's a lot of ground until November and a lot of different scenarios that could play out. For the moment, we've just got to keep our eye on the primaries and see who's going to be the main person to combat Donald Trump coming into 2020.
Yeah. Again, as we said a few times this episode, I think it's just wait and see at this point. In the same way we were saying, it looks like Biden's out a few weeks ago. Now it looks like he's going to win. So, he is kind of the standard establishment candidate for the Democratic Party as well. So it's not necessarily surprising, but it's interesting how much everything has changed and how the field has suddenly narrowed. Sorry,
there's a little bit of a debate to be had about, is this the Democratic Party reacting better than the Republican Party did to an anti-establishment candidate coming into their party? So you could argue that in 2016, the Republicans were slow to react and slow to drop out and endorse a moderate candidate to stand against Donald Trump. In this case, it's really worked out for Biden that all the moderates kind of dropped out and he rose to the top before the progressive candidates could organize themselves to do the same. When there was a very crowded field, Bernie was the clear frontrunner. As more and more people dropped out, Biden suddenly had this meteoric rise. So it may be that the Democrats have learned a little lesson there, or at least the establishment Democrats have learnt the lesson of 2016 and didn't want to repeat it coming into 2020.
So I think that's a wrap for this episode. As always, you can find us in all of the usual places. But if you want to go see the show notes, you should head over to parliamentary.observer/unparliamentary/312. We haven't had that many episodes. It's just I do seasons by the hundreds number. So this is a 12th episode of season 3. I probably didn't need to say that, but I have done. If you want to support this show or other shows from Tinker Tailor Soldier Sponge Productions, then head on over to patreon.com/TTSS. And of course, the most useful thing you can do is just spread the word that you enjoy the podcast, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever service you use to listen to this podcast. Spread the word, tell everyone you like us. Because presumably you do if you're listening to us right now. We'll see you in 2 weeks. So I don't think there's anything else left for me to say than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
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 Bye. Bye. Bye.
I realise in my own show notes, sorry, you can cut this out, but I realise in my own show notes I've mixed up Biden and Bernie.